Street food in India is more than just a culinary delight. It is an integral part of the culture. Students especially find it irresistible. The allure of spicy chaats, crispy samosas, and sweet jalebis is hard to ignore. It's affordable, delicious, and widely available. But sometimes, what is convenient can turn into a nightmare. This essay recounts a tragic incident that took place in a small town in India. Several students were poisoned after consuming contaminated street food. The event shocked the community and highlighted severe lapses in food safety. This was not just an accident, it was a catastrophic failure on multiple levels. The poison in the food led to a medical emergency. Hospitals were overwhelmed and families were devastated. The negligence and greed that caused this disaster were unforgivable. The suffering was immense, and the incident prompted a desperate call for change. The story of these poisoned students serves as a grim reminder. It underscores the importance of food safety regulations and the role of community vigilance. Let us delve into the details of this horrifying event and explore the lessons learned. The source of the contaminated food was a popular street vendor. Known for his tasty treats, he was a favorite among the students. Every afternoon, his stall would be surrounded by eager young customers. The vendor's reputation was built on flavor, not on hygiene. This proved to be a deadly oversight. On that fateful day, the vendor sold a batch of samosas. Unbeknownst to him and his customers, the ingredients were tainted. The potatoes used in the filling had been stored improperly. They were contaminated with a dangerous insecticide. The vendor, driven by profit, ignored basic safety protocols. The food was distributed quickly. Students bought the snacks and carried them back to school. The excitement of an afternoon treat soon turned into a nightmare. Within hours, the toxic food began to take its toll. The distribution of the food was unchecked. There were no inspections, no regulations, and no accountability. This lax attitude towards food safety is what allowed the tragedy to unfold. The first signs of trouble appeared shortly after lunch. Students began to feel unwell. Initially, it was just a general sense of discomfort, but the symptoms quickly escalated. Nausea, vomiting, and severe stomach cramps gripped the young victims. Panic spread through the school. Teachers and staff tried to manage the situation, but they were unprepared. The severity of the symptoms was alarming. Some students collapsed, unable to move. Others cried out in pain, clutching their stomachs. It was chaos. The immediate aftermath was a blur of activity. Emergency services were called. Parents were notified, and panic turned to despair. The sight of ambulances rushing to the school is one that the community will never forget. The students were rushed to the nearest hospital. The sheer number of patients overwhelmed the medical staff. They worked tirelessly, but the poison was potent. The speed and severity of the symptoms made it clear that this was not a simple case of food poisoning. It was something much more sinister. The hospital wards were filled with young patients. Doctors and nurses worked around the clock. Treatments were administered, but the effects of the poison were relentless. Some students showed signs of improvement, while others remained critical. Parents stood by helplessly. Their anguish was palpable. They watched as their children suffered. The medical staff did their best, but the situation was dire. The hospital lacked the resources to handle such a large-scale emergency. Self-care became a crucial part of the recovery process. Families took turns monitoring their children. They provided comfort and support, but the fear never left their eyes. The poison had taken a toll on the students' bodies and minds. The road to recovery was long and uncertain. Some students faced permanent damage. The poison had left scars that would never fully heal. The hospital staff, though exhausted, continued to fight for every life. Their dedication was a beacon of hope in a dark time. Section 5. Response of the school authorities. The school authorities were caught off guard. They had no protocols in place for such a disaster. Their initial response was one of confusion and panic. As the situation unfolded, their negligence became apparent. There was a lack of communication. Parents were not informed promptly. The delay in action exacerbated the crisis. The authorities failed to recognize the severity of the symptoms early on. Valuable time was lost, and the students paid the price. The school principal addressed the media. He expressed sorrow and promised an investigation, but his words rang hollow. The community demanded accountability. They wanted to know how such a lapse could occur. The incident exposed deep flaws in the school's emergency preparedness. Training and resources were woefully inadequate. The response of the school authorities was a stark reminder of the importance of vigilance and proactive measures. The trust placed in them had been shattered. Section 6. Negligence and Greed. The root cause of the tragedy was a deadly combination of negligence and greed. The street vendor prioritized profit over safety. He cut corners to save money. Basic hygiene practices were ignored. The storage of ingredients was substandard. The vendor's greed did not stop there. He sourced cheap, low-quality ingredients. The potatoes were bought from a dubious supplier. The insecticide contamination was a result of improper storage and handling. This recklessness was driven by a desire to maximize profit margins. Negligence was not limited to the vendor. The local authorities failed to enforce food safety regulations. Inspections were rare and superficial. There was a systemic failure in ensuring that street food vendors adhered to safety standards. This negligence and greed culminated in a tragedy that claimed innocent lives. The lack of accountability at every level was evident. The community's trust was broken. The incident underscored the need for stringent food safety measures and regular inspections. Section 7. Investigation and discovery of chemicals. An investigation was launched immediately. The authorities needed to understand what went wrong. Samples of the food were collected and sent to a laboratory. The results were shocking. The food was laced with a potent insecticide. The investigation traced the contamination back to the vendor's storage practices. The potatoes had been kept in a damp, poorly ventilated area. This created an environment for the insecticide to seep into the food. The vendor's disregard for safety was laid bare. The supplier of the potatoes was also scrutinized. It was discovered that they had a history of selling substandard produce. They had bypassed regulations and inspections. The entire supply chain was compromised. The discovery of chemicals in the food was a turning point. It revealed the extent of the negligence involved. The investigation highlighted systemic failures in enforcing food safety standards. The findings were a wake-up call for the entire community. Section 8. The human suffering. The human suffering caused by this tragedy was immense. Families were torn apart. The joy and laughter of childhood were replaced with pain and fear. The students who survived faced a long and painful recovery. Parents were haunted by the sight of their children in hospital beds. The uncertainty of their recovery was a constant source of anxiety. The emotional and psychological scars were deep. Some families lost their children. The grief was unbearable. The community rallied together. They provided support and comfort to the affected families. Vigils were held and prayers were offered. The sense of loss was shared by all. The tragedy had touched every corner of the town. The human suffering extended beyond the immediate victims. The entire community felt the impact. The trust in street food vendors was shattered. The incident left a lasting mark on the collective psyche. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of vigilance. Section 9. Systemic failures. The tragedy exposed multiple systemic failures. The lack of food safety regulations was a major factor. Inspections were infrequent and inadequate. There was no enforcement of hygiene standards. The entire system was flawed. The local authorities failed in their duty to protect the community. There was a lack of accountability. The street vendor operated with impunity. There were no checks in place to ensure that food sold to the public was safe. The school also failed its students. Emergency protocols were non-existent. The response to the crisis was chaotic and uncoordinated. The lack of preparedness had dire consequences. The trust in the institution was eroded. These systemic failures were a wake-up call. They highlighted the urgent need for reform. Food safety regulations needed to be enforced. Regular inspections and accountability were essential. The community demanded change to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. Section 10. Conclusion and call to action. The tragic outcomes of this incident were heart-wrenching. Lives were lost and families were devastated. The students who survived faced a long road to recovery. The incident was a stark reminder of the importance of food safety. Stricter food safety measures are crucial. Regular inspections and accountability are essential. Vendors must adhere to hygiene standards. The community must remain vigilant. Everyone has a role to play in ensuring that such a tragedy does not happen again. The call to action is clear. Authorities must enforce food safety regulations. Schools must have emergency protocols in place. The community must support these efforts. Together, we can prevent another disaster. The story of the poisoned students in India is a grim reminder. It underscores the importance of vigilance and accountability. Let us learn from this tragedy and work towards a safer future for our children. The time for change is now.